This is Cora Dive, bringing you more recordings for Mythology. Today I will be bringing you the 3 readings for the lesson So You Want to Be a Knight, The Road to Camelot, and The Quest for Character. Let's begin, shall we? We will begin with the legends of King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table. Set up for here and move over. And this comes from creativeenglishteacher.com. The real life Arthur was from 500 CE, when the Roman Empire fell in Britain. There was probably a British general who resisted the invading hordes of barbarians. Legends of this general evolved into the tales of a king who ruled during this turbulent time. Throughout the Anglo-Saxon time period, legends of Arthur remained alive. But it wasn't until knights and chivalry came to Britain that the stories took their most famous form. 1066 CE, William the Conqueror, Duke of Normandy, crossed the English Channel and conquered Britain. This ended the Anglo-Saxon time period in Britain and marked the beginning of the medieval age. This painting is from the Battle of Hastings in 1066 CE. And this is likely from events like the SCA. The Norman invasion of 1066. Several new ideas were brought into Britain. Stonework. William forced lords to build their castles out of stone. Feudalism. Instituted the system of feudalism where you have a high king at the top, lords, then knights, then peasants. Introduced the French language, and then chivalry. Knights were mounted warriors who operated by a strict code of conduct, subjecting themselves to the king and the church. And this is a painting of those castles on the hills. Feudalism. Under this system, the king divided up his land among his lords for them to operate. In turn, they owed him their loyalty and the use of their knights. These lords granted lands to the knights, who in turn had to fight for the lords. Peasants lived in squalid huts on the lands of the lords and knights, working that land in order to keep part of the crops for themselves. In part of the castle, an overhead layout of the castle. Castles themselves. Feudalism caused the lords to prosper, and soon there were over 500 stone castles in England. Most castles came with new defenses: a drawbridge, portcullis, arrow loops, moat. Machicolations or overhangs through which projectiles could be dropped or boiling liquids poured. Dungeons and oubliettes, or deep pits filled with adders and toads. A castle with a moat. Another castle with a moat about it. Defending the castle, a siege. Surrounding your enemy's castle, attempting to starve them out or fight your way in. Sieges were much more common than large battles. Some castles kept a year's worth of food and supplies on hand in case of a siege. For a siege to be withstood, the castle well had to stay active. One siege ended very quickly after the well dried up, and the castle dwellers resorted to drinking the blood of their horses and each other's urine. Castle weaknesses: the siege towers, filling the moat, trebuchet attack, grappling up the walls, and sneaking up the latrines. One trebuchet, and another type of catapult. Scaling up a siege wall. Chainmail, a suit of armor. Being knighted. Le Mort d'Arthur, or the death of Arthur. The most famous version of the King Arthur legends set the stories firmly in the medieval time period, combined many of the previous legends into one long narrative of the life of Arthur, written in 1485 by Sir Thomas Malory, an actual knight. Malory wrote Le Mort d'Arthur in prison while serving time for charges of rape and theft. Arthur, King of Britain, founder of the Round Table, wielder of Excalibur, his reign meant a period of justice and peace for Britain, described as a medieval Christian king. And a painting of him. I forget if this was from a show or a movie. And yet another depiction in modern media. Merlin, prophet and magician, born without a father, sired by a devil. Arthur's mentor from the time he was crowned king to his union with Guinevere, symbolizes the old pagan past of Britain. He oversaw the construction of Stonehenge. And a few depictions of Merlin. Sword and Stone. Excalibur, King Arthur's sword, given to him by the Lady of the Lake, and it symbolized his right to rule. And I'm going to assume this is a depiction of the Lady of the Lake giving Arthur Excalibur. So we're seeing a few depictions of that. Guinevere, wife of King Arthur and Queen of Britain. The Round Table came as part of her dowry. And that's a more modern depiction of her. Lancelot, King Arthur's best knight, raised by the Lady of the Lake in her magical underwater palace. Example of the ultimate knight, the epitome of chivalry. And these are some modern depictions of Lancelot, as well as some classical ones. Morgan Le Fay. Le Fay means of the fairies. King Arthur's half-sister, said to be an evil sorceress who constantly tries to usurp Arthur and defeat his knights. A more modern depiction of her, as well as classical. Mordred, King Arthur's illegitimate son, who becomes his father's enemy. Modern depictions of it. Camelot, Arthur's castle and capital city, home of the Round Table, symbolizes the ideal society based on the concepts of chivalry. It is a fictional city, but it has been identified with the ruins of Cadbury Castle in Somerset, England. This is a classical depiction of it. Another. And I believe this is the actual ruins of Cadbury Hill in Somerset, England. And also from above, a shield discovered at Cadbury Hill. And that ends this part of the presentation. And through the field the road runs by to many-towered Camelot. Alfred, Lord Tennyson. There is a certain sense of wonder that comes from reading the tales of King Arthur and his knights of the Round Table, an inkling that you're seeing into a world that is both parts of our history and parts of our dreams as well. A world filled with fantasy, wizards, sorceresses, dragons, yet still suffers from the harsh realities of life, unrequited love, the painful sacrifices of duty, and doomed romance. It's a world that is medieval, yet not at the same time. Instead of the past as it was, it's the past as we wish it had been. The legends of Arthur and his court have been the favorites of poets, painters, and politicians for centuries. Perhaps this is because they tap into our deepest ideals of justice, romance, and valor. Or perhaps because, although they are fantasy, they do not shy away from asking tough questions. Can love trump duty? Can lofty ideals change human nature? Can a person create a legacy that will endure past his own lifetime? For Europeans, the Arthurian legends are a part of their majestic past. The ideals of the Round Table inspired kings who tried to form a link between their reign and that of Arthur. Victorian poets such as Tennyson used Arthurian tales of Britain's past to inspire his country toward a glorious future. Painter poets such as Rossetti and other pre Raphaelites used the stories to feed their yearning for a simpler age. The Arthurian legends are impactful for non Europeans as well. In America, where the legends were reinterpreted with a more democratic slant, Arthur's humble beginnings and his notions of equality at the Round Table found a new audience. The presidency of John F. Kennedy was frequently compared to the splendors of Camelot. Author T.H. White respun Arthur's life into his novel, The Once and Future King, from which Broadway made Arthur the subject of a popular musical, Camelot. There is no question that the Arthurian legends have impacted the world, and this led to the inevitable question: was there a real King Arthur? Many scholars have attempted to identify the historical person who inspired the legends. Their theories culminate in this: if there was a real King Arthur, he lived in Britain during the years following the departure of the Roman Empire and fought against the invading hordes of Saxons. This author, a warlord who fended off barbarian invasion, may have had his Camelot at a site now known as Cadbury Castle. In fact, there are several different proposed locations for the historical Camelot. As further proof of Arthur's existence, there is even a tomb at Glastonbury Abbey that claims to be Arthur and Guinevere's final resting place. As exciting as these historical findings are, they're also bittersweet. No matter how many discoveries are made pinpointing this historical author, he's not the author of legends. No real life person could encompass all that Arthur means. The legendary King Arthur exists outside time, outside reality, outside possibility. Yet, rather than limiting his appeal, this merely increases it, especially for students of myth and legend. Arthur and his Camelot cannot be found in the real world because they're simply larger than life. This process by which history and myth merged to create the unique feel of the Arthurian legend is too complex to detail here. At their most basic level, the stories are of a man's life, a man who strove for more and achieved much, but maybe not as much as he hoped. We see Arthur's birth, his youth, his middle years, and finally his death. We see his youthful enthusiasm fade into complacency, and in the end, when he is faced with many enemies, we see that youthful fire reborn. Along the way, Arthur comes to embody something larger than himself. Arthur and Camelot become one, and when one falls, so falls the other. Arthur's tale ultimately is a tragedy. It is a failed experiment. an attempt at something better in the midst of a dark age. Camelot may have ended in failure, but it still inspires us with its legacy. As the lyrics from the musical Camelot say, don't let it be forgotten that once there was a spot for one brief shining moment that there was known as Camelot. So you want to be a knight. Everyone is familiar with the image of a knight in shining armor, fighting for armor, honor, and the love of a fair damsel. These heavily armored, mounted warriors from the Middle Ages were named knights, from the French word chevalier, which means horseman. They were the most powerful force in their time. They allowed kings to win battles and maintain control of vast kingdoms. Ultimately, they went on to become the symbol of their age. But how did one become a knight? There wasn't a future nightclub that you joined at school. In fact, there wasn't even school. So how were knights made? Prospective knights needed to begin the process early in life. Young, wealthy boys with their hearts set on knighthood would be sent away from their homes around the age of 8 to become a page or serving boy in an established knight's household. A page's job was to run errands in the household. Later, probably about the age of 14 or 15, the boy would become the knight's squire or personal attendant. Through this service, a squire learned the trade of knighthood. He cared for his master knight's weapons and horses. He waited on his master's table, carved his meat, helped him dress. In his spare time, the squire worked on his own training with a lance and sword. Finally, if the squire proved himself capable, he would be knighted around the age of 18. But training wasn't all that went into knighthood. If you wanted to be a knight, you had to have the right equipment. For protection, early knights wore chainmail, a mesh-like armor made from iron rings. This protected their skin from being cut by sword blows or pierced from arrows. Beneath their knee-length chainmail shirt or hauberk, they wore a cloth coat to cushion their skin against battle bruises. The next piece of equipment every knight needed was a horse. This is what separated him from the peasant infantry soldiers. Knights also needed the right kind of saddle, one which had stirrups, so they could stand up and lean into their thrusts as the horses charged. Knights also needed weapons like long lances, swords, and maces to do battle with. All of this equipment added up to a hefty price tag. This meant that in order to be a knight in the first place, you either had to come from a family with enough money to afford this expensive equipment or inherit it from a rich relative. Since armor was basically indestructible, it could be passed down from one generation to another. Most young men bound for knighthood entered the service of a rich lord. There wasn't really a way to get rich in the Middle Ages. You were either born with money or without it. Owning land was the only way to obtain wealth. During this time, feudalism was the predominant system of government. Feudalism was a pyramid of power, and power was determined by land. On top was the king, and he owned all the land in his kingdom, but he needed faithful lords to help him protect it. So, he divided most of his land among these lords and allowed them to manage it. In return, these lords would fight for him when he called them. Then these land-holding lords further divided the land, giving small patches to their knights. From this land, the knights could earn money to afford their costly equipment. In return, the knights vowed to fight for the lords when called upon. The lowest level on the feudal pyramid of power was reserved for the peasants, workers who toiled in the fields of the knights and lords. They lived in poverty, had few rights, and had no hope of rising any higher than their lowly position. Some estimate that nearly 90% of the people living in European feudal societies were peasants. Not all knights were able to enter the service of a rich lord. After all, there were only so many lands to go around. So instead, some knights earned their living by participating in tournaments. These tournaments were spectator sport battles between knights that offered prize money to the winners. Wealthy lords came to watch these events, and ladies came to flirt with their favorite knights. Early tournaments were just big brawls between knights, but later they incorporated sport-like events like jousting. Some tournaments were so involved that they lasted an entire week. Even though these battles were staged, they still used actual weapons, and they could be deadly. Knights were expected to follow the rules of chivalry, or the code of conduct for the ideal knight. The medieval church charged knights to be God's warriors, protecting the weak, upholding a godly life, and battling the enemies of goodness. Becoming a knight was also an official act of the church. Every knight had to undergo a dubbing ceremony, complete with symbolic rituals. The night before a young man was knighted, he took a ceremonial bath to symbolize his purification. After all, he was clothed in all white. Then he spent the rest of the night in the local church praying, asking for God's guidance. In the morning, he would be dubbed an official knight. He was girded with a belt to remind him to avoid sins of the flesh and human lust. He was presented with gilded spurs to give him the courage to serve God. And finally, he was given a sword with which to defend the poor against the rich. His sponsor, who must also be a knight, would strike him to help him remember this momentous day. The tapping of a sword on either shoulder later replaced this blow. It was not only the church that promoted the ideals of chivalry, but also the popular literature of the day. Troubadours, traveling singers who traveled from one castle to another, told tales about valiant knights. Many of these tales featured the legendary British King Arthur and his noble knights of the Round Table, who were the exemplification of chivalric ideas. courteous, well spoken, brave, loyal, and honorable. Although knights remained a power to be reckoned with for centuries, as technology advanced, they were forced to adapt. The invention of the crossbow, which could fire arrows through chainmail, caused knights to use armor made from interconnected sheets of solid metal called plate armor, the type of shining armor typically associated with knights. While plate armor was more effective at combating the crossbow, it made knights a lot bulkier. Suits of plate armor often weighed from 55 to 90 pounds. If a knight fell to the ground in battle, he would require help in order to stand again. When gunpowder was introduced into battle and bullets were able to penetrate even plate armor, armored knights were no longer effective. They were merely bulky moving targets. Knights, as we know them, began to fade away. They became the stuff of legends, yet their spirit lives on through tales like King Arthur and his Knights of the Round Table. And this ends the reading.